data, basically. That this data structure, when you look at it, you can infer how much time was spent generating it because there's limits how fast computers can go. And based on those physical limits, there's no way for anyone, no matter how much money they have, unless they build a faster chip, to speed it up. And building a faster chip means outcompeting TSMC or Intel, and that's like, upwards to $50 billion these days to build a faster fab. So there's a limit to how fast you can build a computer, even with cooling and everything. And the trick is to create a mathematical function that is sequential, so it cannot be parallelized. And that's a somewhat tricky part because you have to make it that, but also make it verifiable. So when you generate this data, you need to be able to verify it in some amount of time that's faster than it takes to generate. Otherwise, it's a pretty useless pretty useless proof. And our construction is extremely dumb, and it was like one of the most trivial ones you could build, and not even being researched anymore because it was so trivial. But if you're familiar with SHA-256, that's the cryptographic hash function that Bitcoin uses for security. It's a very standard hash function used everywhere in cryptography, and basically anything you do on the web, anytime you sign, like when you see that like little lock on your URL bar that has encryption behind it, it's probably using SHA-256 as the hash function to enable that encryption. The way that we run it is we run it sequentially. So when you run it, its output is the next input, and you keep running it in this loop. And because it's cryptographically secure, there's no way for you to parallelize it. There's no way for you to know ahead what the result is going to be 100 iterations. And there's no way to make it any faster. But the way you verify it is you kind of checkpoint it every 1,000 iterations or 100,000. And then those checkpoints are part of the data that you transmit. And when I receive it, I start this process in parallel and as many cores as I have. And then I verify all of them in parallel. So in real time, it takes me less time to verify than it takes somebody to generate. But I thought this was like a really clever thing because there is no arrow of time in mathematics. When often physics equations, when they're described in math, they work forwards and backwards in time. There's nothing really that says that time moves forward. But this is an inherent process that only moves forward. And it's a pretty wild thing to think about it. Is the universe, if it's simulated, is it driven by this kind of process that's only sequentially moving forward? Is that why we don't we can't reverse entropy and all these other things? And that the eureka moment was a pretty wild experience for me. I would say manic for 4 days, couldn't really sleep or talk to my wife, and she had to sit me down and
and then so what you solved was something that was essentially fast and secure, right? And how fast did you think it was going to be? And we'll talk a bit about where it is now, but what kind of TPS, what were you thinking it was going to be there? And what was that compared to anything else at the time as well? Because that's important.
We are very ambitious. And on the back of our envelope, we thought that with hardware at that time, we could get it to run, we called it 710,000 transactions per second at a 1 gigabit. And we got to about 1/10 of that, which is still really, really good.
And how's that compared to ETH, for example, just so people can frame that?
Ethereum can do about 20 to 30 transactions per second right now. And Bitcoin's about 7-ish. And there's modern networks that do hundreds. When you look at Solana as it's running today, its normal load is about 500 to 600 transactions per second. That's just what it does just from applications. But the capacity, as we can measure it, really depends on the hardware that's deployed and what connections it's running at. We have a testnet that's even bigger than their mainnet with the same kind of hardware, similar hardware, I would say, and similar operators running it. And there we can try to spam it and try to knock it down. And we've seen tests there perform over 15,000 TPS.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about the issues that the chain has had as well before we start moving into the future a bit more, because it's always stuff that comes up with Solana. You know, there's been a few times the chain's had to be halted. Talk through that process. What's going on, and how are you guys thinking about that?
This is like our biggest challenge, which is maybe the one that I like to have, because it's all these challenges are coming because we have users, and the chain is on a daily basis. When you look at it in normal transactions from applications from users, just from people using the network, when you look at those about 30 million transactions per day. Peak day was like 65 million. That's more than all the other chains combined. Binance Smart Chain is 1/10 of that. I think Ethereum is 1/30th. And because of this load, we kind of see things that we didn't expect. And we were a bit, I think, short-sighted in the kinds of attacks people would throw at the network. And what we started seeing are bots that are designed to snipe mints, like NFT mints. This is all because of NFTs. There's some auction for some NFT, and people want those NFTs so much that they figure out how to create these bot armies that generate 100 gigabits in one. That's like 10 to, I think some people have seen 10 million packets per second being submitted to a validator.
Wow.
And if there's a bug in any one of these validators where memory grows, really, really quickly, or something that we didn't do well for that load, that validator could shut down, right? Could break, could run out of memory for whatever reason. And if a third of them do that, then the network is basically stalled until some manual intervention brings it back up. So that has happened a couple times. And not only that, there's also been congestion events where there's enough spam, but it's not enough spam to knock it over, but it's preventing users from using it. So that's been, I guess, our curse, but it's because the network is so cheap and fast that there's enough users and applications that is driving that. And it's one of the really most frustrating problems, because the release process for these networks, that's the closest thing I've seen in software to how a chip is built. Once a chip is out, if there's a bug in it, you're kind of screwed, right? You've taped out the wrong thing. It's hundreds of millions of dollars to fix those bugs. So once there is a release, like 1.9 was plagued by these. We had 1.10 baking on testnet. We're verifying it. We're getting it through audits, and we knew that it was going to address some of these fixes. But that time to do it right and make this release is like 10 weeks, right? So for those 10 weeks, it just sucked. Like you as us as engineers, we're like, no, we can, stuff is going to get fixed. And it's hard to predict how well the fixes are going to have impact on the problems you're seeing. But luckily 1.10 shipped, and a bunch of these issues have been solved. And there's a bunch of technologies that are being enabled to, I think, really address a lot of the reliability problems, to the point that I think we can stop calling it mainnet beta and just call it mainnet.
Yeah, and I think, I've always taken the view of it. It's really interesting because I don't ever look at anything in its current state, particularly in this world, because to do that is ridiculous, because, the pace of accelerated change and improvements and iterations is so fast that you have to say, is this likely to be resolved or not resolved? There may be other problems and other issues that come. That's fine, right? And that's how I look. I've always looked at it, and I saw this happening, and I thought, I find that a positive signal, because it's not, because what it means is we see issues, you can get them solved and work on them. Now, whether the fix comes out in a month or a year, it depends what it is. But
yeah, hopefully not a year.
Don't like it because the Bitcoin world doesn't work that way, or at least hasn't for a long time.
Yeah, Bitcoin has different issues. It's designed, to be extremely resilient. And some things that are normal for Bitcoin, like when a bunch of Chinese hash power shut down, there were times where there are 2 hours between blocks on Bitcoin, and that's totally fine. If there's 2 hours between blocks on Solana, the network's dead, because it's designed to make a block every 400 milliseconds. So pager duty is going off. People are trying to figure out why. How is this possible, right? So you kind of have, once you make a faster network, the failure case is different than one on something like Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? Even though in both cases, the data is never lost. You never threaten the state. Like the actual thing that the network is securing is this copy of the ledger that's replicated. On Solana, it's close to, about 4,000 times, and Bitcoin's about 12,000 times, and Ethereum's like 6,000 times. That's the security of the network. That's what you're trying to protect. As long as that state is replicated and at least one of those copies survives and is able to tell the world, no, look, here's the valid copy. You have all this cryptographic signatures to prove it. Everything is fine in terms of the security of the network. But reliability, when you've designed something to run like at a 400 millisecond step, is totally different than something that runs at a 10-minute step like Bitcoin. So we have just a whole different set of challenges than a network like Bitcoin.
One of the things that you've probably heard that I spend a lot of time looking at Metcalfe's law and how to value these networks, and that's when Solana really got onto my radar screen, because it's the only thing since ETH that I've seen where we've seen so many users accelerating such a pace over time. It slows up and slows down depending on what's happening in the market, with the amount of connectivity between the nodes, i.e. the developer activity and other stuff going on. How the hell did that happen? Because it's pretty extraordinary. It was quite a big breakout versus almost any other chain, right? I think the only one, Polkadot, has something similar, but not in the same way with end users. They've got quite a lot of developers. How did that happen?
We got lucky in a couple decisions, I think. So we never raised a ton of money in those early days. We were always kind of had 18 to 20 months of runway. Our competitors raised hundreds of millions of dollars. We had like a big break where we raised 14 in like the summer of 2018. So we never had enough runway to like build EVM compatibility or anything that wasn't like purely necessary to show that the network was fast. So we had our own set of our own language, smart contract language, and engineers are naturally curious. And that was like, I think, a really good decision. Had I had more resources, we probably would have built EVM compatibility, and then we would have been one of the 10 EVM chains trying to compete with, L2s and Ethereum itself and like a whole bunch of other like things. The other thing that we made the right decision was that when we were launching, we launched March 16th. Like we announced our auction, I think March 9th or March 10th or something like that. The network went live. 3 days later was the double black swan. Everything in the market crashed. Bitcoin dropped, and the S&P 500 dropped by 70%. This was 2020 March. We were just so exhausted from getting to the point that nobody wanted to delay, so we just went for it. And that was another, I think, lucky decision, because we were just a hair earlier than all the other next generation chains, earlier than Polkadot, than Binance Smart Chain, than anyone else. And because we were new and had like new properties, that I think got the ball rolling with devs. Like devs are naturally curious and they want to try new things. You give them new tools, they'll go start messing around. And just being, I think, these are like decisions that are really hard to predict will have that much of an impact. But looking back at it, that I think those two things like played a really outsized role.
The other thing that had an outsized role that you probably weren't expecting was NFTs.
Yeah. This was NFTs, CryptoKitties, like literally, this was something that, we in our marketing slide, like, look, CryptoKitties knocked down Ethereum. This one happened on Solana. But we didn't really think about them like Solana's tagline was blockchain and NASDAQ speed, and we really focused on projects like Serum. But we saw NFTs were started to happen on Ethereum, and they were interesting because they were forming communities. There were people that were getting into these PFP sets and kind of acting like early bulletin board style social networks, like in the 90s. So we had a two engineers from labs build out the smart contracts to define the NFT standard, and kind of like that was the Metaplex being incubated. And as soon as that was launched, and we had like a couple mints that we got together, like we scoured the earth for anybody that would want to mint on Solana. Nobody really wanted to at the time. But we got the tools out there, and the decision that we made, which was again lucky one, was that we should make the tools available freely and easy for non-engineering devs to just go mint some art. So we tried to minimize it to the point that it was kind of like WordPress. You still had to be somewhat technically savvy, like clone a GitHub repo and go run through it and run through the minting process. But that was enough to where we started seeing first, just a few people, and then hundreds, and then thousands.
And from what I can sense, and this is what I really want to hear from you about, is you figured out actually you can be the mass market consumer application. Is that where your head is moved to?
I always thought that if we can get the serum use case to work, then everything else from an engineering perspective will be easy. Because that's a really, really hard thing. That's a central limit order book that runs on chain. I think we're still the only smart contract